Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agri. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking to Agri's Amy Watkins, Sustainability Project Manager, Mark Dews, Sustainable Farming Lead, and farmer Rod Smith, who farms Beal Farm up there in Northumberland. Today, we're going to focus on farm productivity and resilience and how that can be achieved by improving soil health and Agri's Green Horizons initiative. So, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, Tony.
Good morning.
So let's start off, Amy, with you, the Green Horizons initiative. What are the key elements of that?
So within our Green Horizons initiative, we've obviously got 5 key elements, from improving soil resilience to enhancing the environment, increasing farm productivity and viability, focusing on integrated pest management, and also talking about trying to extend this out to other stakeholders within the industry as well. These are all kind of the main key elements that we see in terms of achieving sustainable food production. And today, really, what we're going to be discussing, as we have on future podcasts, is around soil health and soil resilience. But focusing more today on the productivity side and how, by improving your soil resilience, this can lead to productivity and viability gains as well on farm.
That's very well put, and it's clearly really important at this moment in farming, where we actually maybe need to put some of the talk into actually walking that talk, don't we? And helping farmers turn that into, as you said, that real productivity. So, Mark, when we're talking about soil health, what are we actually talking about? What are we trying to achieve?
Really, soil health could be summarised between organic matter and biological activity. So those are the two sort of key elements that we're trying to build upon and build that resilience to cope with some more extreme weather events that we've all been experiencing over recent years. And it goes alongside lots of other things like soil structure and drainage and water management. But if we were to boil it down to the things that we can measure, then those are the two: organic matter and biological activity. And I think that's what Rod has been developing on his farm, and I think we'll come on to talk about the way in which that has facilitated the kind of productivity gains that he's seen up there in Northumberland.
Yeah, and thank you for that superb link there, Mark, because indeed we do need to hear from Rod, who's farming in Northumberland. And we must actually say at this point, Rod is a celebrity here from the point of view that he is Northern Hemisphere Guinness World Champion for yield. Rod, tell us more, is that right?
It is, yes. In 2015, we got 16.52 tonnes a hectare of Dickens. So, yeah.
And just let's stay with that for a second. What do you think was the key recipe to achieving such an amazing yield?
It was actually the soil. It was interesting what we learned there. It was a failed bean crop. And because there wasn't a huge plant population, but beans really ripped up the soil and left it in a very friable sort of state. And that got me quite interested. And that was way back in 2015. So we've been experimenting ever since. We learned a lot from that year, what to do, where we went wrong. And now we're starting down the journey of where we are today. No doubt we'll talk about it.
Yeah, fantastic. And, it is great to celebrate that fantastic productivity, but understanding why is the key, isn't it? To be able to replicate that again. And from what you were saying just now, your challenge, your aim now is to get that global world record back from New Zealand. Is that right?
Correct. Well, we learned an awful lot about that, as I said, and if we can actually emulate where the highest yielding areas, and we were the adjudicator sitting in the combine, we were achieving 22 tonnes a hectare over a 2.5 hectare block. So that gives us an indication of what the potential. So I realised we're not going to get that over the whole farm, but we were let down quite badly and only got 16.52 out of that field. So we know there's more to come.
Fantastic, and it's great. What a challenge to be facing and trying to win. So you talked about the soil, and Mark was talking there about soil health. What have you been doing differently to improve your soil health?
There's been various paths that have gone down, but the introduction of compost, which is basically as FYM, farmyard manure, put into windrows, We put, whether we put some hen muck in, we might just put gypsum in, and gypsum is basically like a stabilizer to try and keep it relatively dry, try and keep the nutrients within the pile of compost. There's a windrow machine that goes through it, so you create this really lovely mixture. And the temperature will get up to sort of 55, 60 degrees, so it's killing all the weed seeds. So we go through this process every 2 to 3 weeks. We'll go through 3 times in total, and that compost is then ready to apply. And it applies very evenly across the field, and that's the key, applying it evenly.
This compost, is this an exercise? Is it accessible for other farmers? I mean, is it something else that could be replicated elsewhere?
Of course it can. There's a lot of farmers that are mainly big arable units, but there's an awful lot of livestock farmers. And obviously this collaboration, these guys have the highs and the lows of the straw price going up and down, over £100 a tonne that comes down. If there's more collaboration between farmers swapping straw for muck but put it into a windrow, then we're actually, I've had the Environment Agency and Natural England on site to have a look at what we're doing, and they're behind us actually, and that takes us onto the cover crops. We're realizing that there's an awful lot more to it by putting compost on prior to a spring barley crop. We're making a 30% reduction in fertilizer, so we're looking now to see if we can make any more reductions on the wheat crops as well.
Yeah, and so you're not just talking about, okay, I've got some compost, we chuck it on the land. You're properly managing the value of retaining those nutrients, optimizing the nutrients that are in that compost, and as you say, applying it evenly. So you're looking at that material with a very serious intent of how you can get the best from it, aren't you?
Totally, and we're still learning. You know, it's not one size fits all, and this is where sharing the information is quite with the audience is obviously a good idea.
Now, and just while we're talking about your farm, you also mentioned the cover crop. So, and we'll come back to Mark and Amy in a minute, but just in terms of what cover crops are you growing and how are you using them?
Well, again, we've mixed with different cover crops, and we're still trialing away. These are all trials. We've been using tillage radish, oil radish, and phacelia, and we found that the deep tap roots of the radishes work quite well, and trying to alleviate any compaction because we're trying to minimize how much we touch the soil. I still think there's an area of mixing that soil just a little bit, a couple of inches, with whatever compost or green matter or green manures which we have. Once we have the desiccation of these cover crops, it sort of works in quite nicely. We've never seen such even spring barley crops. And you know, to put it in a nutshell, the last thing we've moved away from the plough, not entirely because it is a reset button. However, moving away from the plough has allowed that soil to capture all the nutrients that are within that soil. And what we're doing is adding compost to get the P and K levels, as well as everything else in the periodic table. I haven't applied any P and K for the last 5-6 years.
So Mark, from your point of view, what is actually changing in the soil profile? What is the benefit of what Rod is doing on his farm?
So those soil amendments are really helping to drive the functionality of the soil biology, the nutrient cycling, the kind of functional organic matter build up as well. And you know, Rod talks about the species that have worked for him on his particular farm and his particular system. But I think that's important to kind of consider each individual circumstances on their own, and to look at what the best mix of cover crop species are and how to integrate them into your production system. So in Rod's case, it's radish and phacelia based overwinter cover crop going into a spring crop. But we could look at lots of different things. We could look at legumes building up nitrogen and fixing nitrogen, summer cover crops, companion crops with oilseed rape, and all of that diversity can help to support a more diverse ecosystem of biology in the soil, all of which drive in the kind of resilience of the soil and the ability of it to store nutrients, recycle nutrients, and to manage water as well.
Yeah, and Amy, coming back to Agri's Green Horizons, which is an initiative there to help us move in this direction. You know, it really is ticking some of those boxes in terms of improving soil resilience, you know, using integrated farm solutions there to help us achieve that. And as Rod has started to hint at, and I want to come back to it in a minute, but also improving farm profitability and viability. It's ticking some of those boxes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a big part of this is, trying to reduce your reliance on inputs and what you're doing to the soil, trying to reduce the intensity of your cultivations and everything else that goes with it. And Rod's a classic example of trying to do that by using things like organic amendments to improve soil health, improve soil resilience, and therefore over time reducing his reliance on cultivations and therefore helping with your costs and also your time involved in producing that crop.
Yeah. Rod, interestingly, Mark was just talking about soil resilience, and we've hinted at, helping farmers have a more resilient soil with regards to water and availability for crops, particularly during these very, very unpredictable weather windows. Have you seen the improvements in your soil help you with that resilience, that helping the crop in terms of evenness of yield and a sort of a more even pattern of productivity?
Very much so. And in a relatively short space of time, I inherited the workforce and the farming methods from my father. It was very much a plough-based power harrow, and it was a case when fuel and labour was extremely cheap back then. So therefore, it was another pass, make it as fine as possible. But on the wet years, we found that the soil smelt. It was sour. It had an awful smell about it. So heavy land, it does require aeration in whatever form. Now, if you can do that with steel, that's fair enough. If you have to, but that's expensive. If you can use cover crops as an introduction, then that starts to make a little bit more sense. So with the heavy soil with high clay content that we have, we decided to go down a slightly different route, alleviate the compaction, and then try and keep the compaction on the top. We're on low profile tires, we're on tracks on some of the machines, and that's starting to make a difference. We're seeing a lot more worm activity. The soil smells better. And yes, we're increasing the soil organic matter, soil health. Biodiversity is obviously, what Mark said, is the use of cover crops. And we are seeing that with the thunderplumps of water and rainfall that we're getting every now and again, we're seeing far better water infiltration. So something's starting to work. So we feel we're going down the right path.
And as you have said, Rod, many farmers are also commenting that they can also notice the difference of how the land feels.
Yeah, I've got two agronomists, and they're both saying the same, that when they're doing the farm walks, they're finding it far easier in the autumn and early spring walking across the land. They're saying it's in far better nick than they used to walk across. So something's clearly working.
Yeah, superb. It's great to hear. Could you share with us now, some of the productivity, some of the financial benefits that you're seeing as a result of all this hard work?
Well, we're very fortunate just now that we have stewardship schemes which are available and open to farmers. And I would encourage farmers to embrace them, because cover crops are paid just over £100 a hectare, followed by a low input spring barley. And that's another £100 a hectare. So I've got over £200 a hectare head start before anybody else, unless they're in the same sort of schemes. It gives you the chance to then, which we've been doing, is putting compost on. So we've had to reduce our fertilizer, because it's a low input spring barley, by 30%. But we're still probably going to get the yields. Now we're trialing this out when we're doing different things. We do trials for a local seed merchant. So this is starting to have quite a major effect. If I can maintain yield and applying less, in other words, become more efficient, we're using liquid safe on the liquid fertilizer. So it's almost like an inhibitor. So we're trying to get more efficiency about what we're applying. And all this is bottom line. Probably speaking to the wrong person regarding as much cost, because I'm quite happy to spend that little bit more, keeping the crops clean. It's almost like an insurance.
Thanks, Rod, and some really interesting thoughts there on productivity on farm. Coming to you now, Mark, you've mentioned impact per tonne of production before. What does that mean?
So yeah, sustainability or sustainable farming, in my definition, is about minimising the unintended negative impacts of the essential work of producing food. And the way I like to consider that is in terms of the impact per tonne of production. And clearly where the productivity is greater, the yields are higher, then we can spread that kind of impact over a bigger number of tonnes. And with Rod's system there, he's both reducing his inputs and maintaining or potentially increasing yields in some places, obviously in his world record attempts at increasing yields, and thereby reducing the overall impact per tonne of production. I mean, I think one thing that we do have to consider is the actual thing that we're producing. The type of food we're producing. A milling wheat may have a bigger kind of dietary benefit than a feed wheat or a feed barley or whatever. But given that complexity that we can't always address, then if for any given kind of set of produce commodity, then by reducing the impact of the thing that we're growing, then we can reduce the overall impact on the environment and on climate change. So in Rod's example there, reducing his fertilizer use by 30%, we all know that fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer is the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions from arable production, and that is the area where we will have to make the biggest gains if we are ever to get near to this net zero challenge that we have. And I'm sure you've talked about that on previous podcasts.
Right. So it's not just what's happening in terms of the benefits on that farm, but it's, as we can see from the Green Horizons initiative, it's that broader benefit of the direction that we're travelling in, isn't it? Amy, a question for you. Can what Rod's doing on his farm be applied to other farms across the UK?
I think taking into account both what Mark and Rod have said, I mean, every farm's different. What's going to work on every farm will vary. Obviously, Rod's based up in the north compared to somebody further down south. It might be very, very different. But as Rod's alluded to, that whole collaboration point is quite important in terms of achieving some of these goals. And I think it is on the rise. I think more collaboration, things like this are happening and are vital in terms of working towards sustainability, closing that whole loop of nutrient cycling and circular economy. So I think it is a way we can all start moving towards it, but in our own different ways. It's going to vary depending on where you are in the country, depending on your circumstances and what's available to you, basically.
Thanks, Amy. And so bringing this podcast together, what top tips can you all offer listeners who are listening in today?
I think, to be perfectly honest with farmers, I think you've got to be prepared to adapt your farms to the changing and challenging times ahead, especially when it's involved in climate and the high volatility of prices. If you're fortunate to have storage, then that's great. Buy when the price is right. But yes, basically adapt your farms to these changing times.
A great top tip. Mark, what's your top tip of the day?
I'm going to pick up that adaptability theme as well and say that we should try to adapt all these different techniques that we all talk about and apply them to our own farms. So look at the way we can apply them to our own farms, our own soil types and our own systems to leverage the greatest benefits that we can in our own situations.
And Amy, from your point of view, how would you sum up today's podcast? What would be your takeaway message?
I think I'd look at the overarching term of sustainability, as we've discussed. We've talked a lot about the environmental side of things, from enhancing the environment and soil resilience, but for people not to forget about the economic side of things. Obviously, to be sustainable, you have to be in business, most importantly. So it's about balancing that economic and environmental side of sustainability.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, all of you, Rod, Mark and Amy, for today's podcast. Absolutely fascinating podcast and a real farm practical experience on show there, clearly demonstrating that by looking after soil health, we also look after farm resilience and sustainability. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agri.co.uk. See you next time.